Hey guys, Ron Finney Opinion Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. So in today's video, we're going to be reviewing the next GUI main discography. So this starts out with the next GUI demo mixtape, uh, which and this mixtape starts out with saying something in French. So already we're off to a bad start. Then we transition into Decades of Synthetic Tears 1 and 2, which, this is a re-release of old material. It's just here to pad out the EP's runtime. And, this comes into a question of the overall coherent stylistic identity of the album, of which there is none. We have these two ear ambient tracks, then, which, by the way, the volume of these is wildly different than the rest of the EP. Then we transition suddenly into these actual rap songs with like generic rap beats. So we get into Synthetic Respect, the third track, or the fourth track if you count the French intro, which is okay for the first 30 seconds, but then it just repeats itself for the rest of the song. This is going to be a recurrent theme across this discography. Uh, the song also lacks a strong melodic line. A lot of these early songs have this issue. So we have the song Next 2516, which has this same issue. Um, it's an ambient melody in 2516, but it doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't really have a coherent melody at all. It's just some notes, really. Uh, Pretty bad. Not good. Then we get to Demon Inscriptions, or Choked Up, as some of the OG fans might know it as. That's what it was originally released under. Um, so this is the first wrapping of the album, just about halfway through. However, on this album, it's pretty much impossible to make out anything the rapping is said. I don't know if this is an issue with the mic quality, if this is the issue with the mixing. It's probably both of them combined. But basically, the rapping on this album is very quiet. It's very muddy. It's basically inaudible. Uh, and also in this track, I think that the flow lags behind the beat a bit. It could be gridded up a bit better. Next up, we have William with more inaudible rapping. The refrain, "Call this song William, I'm brilliant," is delivered in monotone. So this song pretty much lacks any melodic thread. And much of the song is just silent, just inaudible rapping over a total lack of instrumentals. Uh, Next, we have Genetic Secret, a strange instrumental, the only good thing I can say about it is at least short. Then we get into the Decades of Synthetic Tears 3 to 4 remix, which again is not really a song, it's just a bunch of samples smashed together, which is generally an amalgamation of unfunny jokes and other ear rape noises. Then Benson just re-uploads a Jonathan Singer rap without any additions. So yeah, this track had a lot of potential. Jonathan Singer laid down some fantastic bars, but this is kind of just the laziest possible way to include this on this mixtape. So I thought this was pretty disappointing. Then Raymond the Raveman, where, at least you can hear Benson's voice because it's so drenched in filters, but there's next to no other instrumentation on the track, and definitely the flow and the poetic lyricism here, well, no, they are not carrying this track for a full 2 minutes. So finally, at the last two tracks of this album, we finally get something worth listening to. We have Coda, the intro to Coda, which is a distinct melodic line, short, does what it needs to do, and it introduces the coda, which really is the only listenable song in this entire EP, and I think it's one of the better songs in the next GUI discography. So for this album, I'm feeling a strong 4 to a light 5. I'd say the best track is Coda, and the worst track is William. Okay, so the next release, the Memorial Mixtape. Now, this album clocks in at an ambitious length of 42 minutes. And, we look at all the other releases, they're like shorter. So you have to ask yourself, 62 minutes for a solo, the next GUI rap project, is that going to be justified? Well, spoiler alert, the answer is no. A resounding, easy no. Even from the first track, it's clear that this album places very little value on the time of the listener. This song is just repeating the same bars with minor re-instrumentation, but it's the same melody, it's the same beat. It's the same 2 bars over and over again for 4 whole minutes. And then in the next song, Slow Drum and Jazz Sample, we have the same pattern, 2 bars repeated again and again. The variety in the drums on this track is at least a little bit greater than on the previous, but yeah, and here the melody is even sampled, the 2-bar repeated melody. I mean, I guess we know the next UI is generally adverse to writing melodic lines. Next, we have ZZZ1, which just samples a network-attached storage with a beat over top. So, I mean, this is what a rap track sounds like when you have a rapper with decent flow, right? ZZZ2 starts off with a meandering chromatic melody that really doesn't go anywhere, before dropping in once again another entire rap song by a different artist. Ghoulhead sponsored by Raycons. Hard Landing repeats a single bar at a few different tempos with a bunch of annoying earache clips because Benson didn't know how to EQ. But the drum beat sounds a little bit like Bleed from Meshuggah, though Benson says there was no direct inspiration there. It was just probably copied from a similar YouTube tutorial. But, that's pretty epic. I like Meshuggah. Next, we have a single annoying sample, which is repeated over and over, like the single one-note sample. There are a bunch of clipping issues in this song. There are a few seconds where this one annoying sample isn't spammed that are okay, but then we go right back into blaring it across the song. Next, we have Intrudin, which, really, it's one song repeated 3 times. You have to listen to the same song 3 times back to back. Really unclear why that was necessary. There's going to be a music video of this song, but, well, that never panned out. That's some deep lore I won't go into here. Next up, we have Aid Lamau, which I guess is Benson laughing at the listener who's subjected themselves to this. We have an inanely repetitive melody from an annoying sample. Until then, we inexplicably transition into some vomit of random notes on a piano and an ambient section which fades in and out of some beat interspersed with random earache beat. This is just painful to listen to. This track does nothing for me. Next up, we have Friction, which has a sample from Thrack, from Vroom Vroom, if I'm not mistaken, which somehow has avoided being copy striked by Robert Fripp, which, that in itself is an achievement. Of course, the main thing this track does is just makes me wish I was listening to Thrack, but, as I'm sure you can see on the wall behind me, I'm a bit partial to King Crimson, so that's definitely going to influence my opinion of this track. Then we have The Next Guy, which somehow manages to have the most repetitive beat yet, and an annoying fake-out ending. I thought the song was over, but then I look and there's still like another minute left, and I'm like, oh my god, more of this shit. So that was pretty disappointing. Next we have The Aberration, which is this ambient track with a bunch of chimey noises. I liked the beginning of Mute on the 2015 Native Construct album Quiet World a bit better than this track, but I get the idea. Again, this is really a transitionary track into a remix of someone, the next GUI, found on the quote-unquote rap Discord. Their rapping is slightly better than the other rapping exhibited on this album, but, well, that's not saying much. Then the next GUI repeats the aberration like in its entirety, not even 5 minutes later, just with less reverb. There's no motive development, there's no like thematic reprisal. It's just repeating the exact same song with less reverb. I don't understand. He was, I guess, really desperate to pad out the album length. Whoa, and we'll get to that. Next up, we have Song. One of the only things that has sung vocals. We had some a cappella later, but this is the only thing with sung vocals. I'd say that the next GUI needs to purchase a better microphone. This song has some distinct, though bland, melodic and harmonic lines, so that's a nice change. And I would say the singing, generally it sounds unconfident, like the next GUI doesn't really want to be singing. That's just the feeling I get from it. And then we have Pause for Piano, the 20-minute Goliath that probably took the next GUI less than 20 minutes to record. You spend less time recording it than the actual length of the song. It's just 20 minutes of discordant, meandering piano. There's no perceivable melody. Even the next GUI himself admits the only reason this song exists is because he wanted to pad the album length. And then we have Concludent, which is the end of the album. At this point, I was so numb after listening to 60 minutes of this that honestly, there's not much to say. It's short. It's a simple melody that repeats itself a few times, and then the album's over. So I would give this album a light 3 to a strong 2. My favorite song is Friction. I think the worst song is obviously Pause for Piano. Really, this album is just too long and it's too repetitive. So that's that one. Next up, we have the Absolute Wheelie. Now, the Absolute Wheelie starts off really strong. The Absolute Wheelie intro is, I think, one of the strongest songs in the Next GUI discography. It's well mixed. The rapping sounds coherent. The microphone quality sounds good. Some of the bars are pretty decent. So I go into this EP thinking, oh, this is a noticeable improvement. This EP is going to be good, right? Sadly, this does not last at all throughout the EP. The next song immediately has awful mixing issues. It's hissy, it's clippy, but the Potassium Player says Markiplier in it, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, that was a cool sample from the Potassium Players. Then the previous GUI has a worse flow than Absolute Wheelie, and again, I think the mixing here is slightly off. This song also, it gets the release date of the album wrong, so that's kind of bizarre. On Stack, the next GUI seems to have decided to record themselves blowing into the microphone to use as a beat sample, which is really disconcerting. I don't know why this was a decision that was made. Back on Attack features a wavery a cappella intro and then a guest rapper from the Eminem Discord that's actually worse than the next GUI. And I think someone should tell the next GUI to edit out the sound of breathing in between phrases. I have to say the a cappella sections of this track sounds like a lack of confidence is symptomatic here. Same with the singing. It sounds quiet, it sounds wavery. It sounds like the next GUI doesn't really want to be performing a cappella, but is doing it anyways. And if you're going to do it, you might as well commit to it. So Apeshit 2, next track, it's not really music, it's kind of just like a random, not particularly funny skit. Then we get into ZZZ3, which definitely lives up to its name through some boring ambient meanderings in its intro. And then some rap vocals come in, which are so drowned in effects, you might as well call it Ophelia. Then it rounds it out with some Eminem samples. Then out of the blue, Benson drops I'm at the Whole Foods, which, shockingly compared to all these other songs, actually has a coherent song structure. It has a chorus, it has verses, whatever. However, the song would benefit greatly from some instrumental development. It's pretty repetitive. And again, the vocal mixing leaves something to be desired. This track also rhymes upstate with fucked up state, so that's not particularly impressive. The detuned outro effect at the end is interesting. That's an interesting way to end a track. However, on Oh Man, the detuned outro gets repeated, the exact same technique, a track later. Then we have a track from, and then Oh Man also has a track from, a sample, sorry, from The Matrix that really sounds like it was recorded on a phone in front of a television. Some noise gate could really go a long way here. That said, the vocal mixing in the rest of this track is comparatively decent, as is the melody. Then we have the Lightspeed remix, which is, I don't know, it's generally unimpressive. Nothing really stands out. And then suddenly the song sharply fades out into the next song, which is a Linkin Park cover from, I guess, one of Christopher Peters' favorite albums. So maybe Christopher Peters would appreciate that more than I do. But yes, that exists. Then we have the Hard Landing remix, which shows up to prove that, in fact, Tiger 35 is the worst rapper to be featured on this album. This track has some weird crossfades and mixing too, and more clipping issues, and some yodeling, which doesn't really fit in melodically or stylistically with anything else. And then again, another annoying fake ending. I'm listening to this track. I want it to be over. I think it is. I know there's more of it. And then we have the final three tracks, which again, I think is really emblematic of kind of this EP's lack of a coherent vision, right? We have a re-release of a Decades of Synthetic Tears track, which, generally is not particularly funny, though it does feature the correct ranking of the Mars Volta discography, as I would rank them myself, in fact. So that's pretty cool. Then we have another just entire sample of someone else's rap with generic beat slapped on it. And then we have a very busy MIDI interpretation of a Pokemon theme. So these don't really seem to fit in very well with the rest of the album. They seem kind of just like they were thrown on at the end. Overall, I'd give this album a strong 5 to a light 6. And I'd say the best track is Absolute Wheelie, and the worst tracks are Back on the Attack and the Hard Landing remix. So next up we have, next up we have Viceroys, which starts off with a really bland, misleadingly titled hype music, which really just goes nowhere for 3.5 minutes. Once that's over, we get the Fortress, which demonstrates, I think, a lot of technical improvement in terms of the quality of VST instruments we're using, the quality of mixing. So this is a lot of technical improvement, but it's a pretty uninteresting, repetitive melody. It has some decent melodic ideas, but they don't develop, and they quickly become repetitive. The track's 3.5 minutes long. It does not really do anything with that runtime. Next, we have Inversion, which has a very scooped guitar VST and pretty repetitive melodic phrase, but it has a little bit more variety and orchestration on top of this repetitive melodic bass to keep it a little more interesting, but still, it gets pretty repetitive when you're repeating the same like 2-bar guitar melody over and over. Next up, we have Abyss Mode, which is a simpler melody, but it's a longer one, and it's not quite as repetitive, and there's enough variety in orchestration to keep it just interesting enough to make the track enjoyable. Then we have Creative, which is a fairly abrasive synth sound, a discordant melody that's not really pleasant to listen to. At least this track is short, right? Next, we have In Your Own, which again has a King Crimson sample. This one is so pitch shifted, you probably wouldn't realize it's the beautiful voice of Adrian Bellew. Again, here the melodic idea is decent, but it's repetitive. A lot of these songs suffer from just being longer than they need to. If you have one melodic idea, it's not going to make it a 3.5-minute song, even though that's what you typically see as a song length, right? The mix on Excite Bike is so abrasive. It really overloads the high end. It makes it extremely unpleasant to listen to. You know, I had to like really drop my volume listening to this one. And again, it's not really interesting melodically. And then we have, however you pronounce this, chiaroscuro, which sounds like it could almost have an interesting melody. It could, there's like a melodic seed here that could be developed into an interesting melody, and that could have a lot of variations, but the track just doesn't do this. It kind of just repeats the same melody over and over. So overall, I'd say this album features a lot of improvements from the technical side. So generally, it's less unpleasant and abrasively terrible as earlier releases. But on the other hand, it's a lot more boring. There's not very much on this album that stands out. There's not very much on this album that's memorable. I think the best song is Abyss Mode, and the worst songs are Creative and Excite Bike. And for this album, I'm feeling a light 5 to a strong 4. Next up, we have Gradient, which doesn't really feel like a mainstay in the thenextgui discography quite as much as a lot of these other albums do. These are all like very simple, stripped down melodies and beats over just samples. And the songs on this album, a lot of them sound very similar, especially the beginning of this, well, not album, the beginning of this EP, that is. It all sounds pretty similar. So we start off with ZZZ4. It's not particularly repetitive, it's fairly short. Some of the mixing at the high end is kind of abrasive. ZZZ5 repeats a lot of what we see in ZZZ4. I mean, it's not an exact repetition, but it sounds the same. There's very little going on outside of the samples. This has kind of a weird beat that doesn't quite groove with anything else that's happening. ZZZ6, again, very little going on melodically or instrumentally, few sparse chords and a simple beat. And then ZZZ7, strangely, it has a sample whose tempo is totally different from the underpinning melody and beat. So this feels really disjointed. It's like a double time sample. It does not fit very well. ZZZ8 is just repeating melodies and beats from previous tracks in this EP with a really filter-drenched sample. ZZZ9, at least, it sounds different from the other tracks here, but it doesn't necessarily sound better. It just sounds different. Then finally we have ZZZ10 with an abrasive sauce synth and egregiously over auto-tuned vocals. This track is practically unlistenable, and then it devolves into some random squarish synth noises, and then it suddenly ends. And God, was I happy when that track was over. But of all these tracks, I'd say ZZZ4 is the best, and ZZZ10 is the worst. Then we have Nuclear Winter. You know, this track, it contains the first actual humorous skit in the thenextgui track, which is really thanks to Mohammeduddin with his iconic lines such as "Thumbs up reactions, good Toad 5." Thanks, Mohammed. You're our hero. Then we have the Stoneface promotional song, which, this song got some good verses. It's got some more mediocre verses that are a little more poorly delivered, but let's focus on the positive. If these vocals were better edited, and he did multiple takes on some of the worst deliveries, maybe, I think this could be a pretty good song. Though that said, the beat here is pretty recycled and repetitive. Then on Stepped On, it kind of sounds like the next GUI is suffering from a cold. The voice, the delivery here is kind of sounds just congested. It's a bit muddy. And then we have Jimmy, where we're returning to some old patterns you might hope we'd left behind, of just smashing together a bunch of random samples in a generally incoherent manner, calling it a day. These samples, they really don't conform to the beat in the way you might wish. And this track also, just to top it off, features some less than talented guest rappers, let's say, and let's just leave it at that. Then the next actual track, there's some intermission song here, and then we come up onto Among Us strip, and whoa, not to shout my own praises, but I think the instrumental here is pretty good. And more than that, it doesn't get repeated for 3.5 minutes. This song has a single mediocre instrumental idea. It puts it out there and then it ends. That's it. I don't know why the instrumentals here are so quiet compared to literally everything else on the album. It's kind of weird. Next up, we have some Bill Shot 2 action with, again, more poor guest rappers. Then we have Raymond the Raveman 2. The intro to the song is already a total clusterfuck. Honestly, Raymond the Raveman was in no way good enough song to even warrant a sequel. And though, of course, the sequel substantially improves on the original, it's still not as good. And any decency that its beat and melody might have had is very quickly worn out through its repetitiveness, and the effects drowning the voice out are once again pretty shitty. And also, I think it would have been better if we echoed the Potassium Player's Markiplier sample in the background when Markiplier was brought up in the song. That would have been a good change. Next up, we have Untitled. This song is just some unaccompanied rapping, and you can really tell it doesn't flow at all. The bars are pretty bad, and there's nothing else to distract from it. Next up, we have the return of Tiger 35, showing up once again to prove that he really should not be rapping on anything. This is terrible, like meta rapping. All he talks about is how he's talking about things. And then this song also randomly includes a Discord ping sound effect in the middle of it, just to be annoying. So that's pretty classic. Next up, we have Instigator, which is another case of we have a beat here that doesn't mesh very well with the shitty bars the next GUI drops. It just feels a little bit like we're listening to two songs at once. Then we have This Is Heck, where for some inexplicable reason, the next GUI has decided to pitch shift themselves into chipmunk frequencies. This was undoubtedly a poor decision. I will be the first to say it. Then, once again, on Nuclear Winter, we have this beat and bars that don't ever really come together. Again, it kind of feels like listening to two songs at once. Again, we have this issue on Trimmy AM. And additionally, this song just has some pretty bad bars. And then our even higher pitched chipmunk noises come back for some good measure, just in case this song wasn't unenjoyable enough. Then we have song 2, which definitely features some very profound lyrical content, but is poorly sung and lacks any instrumental accompaniment. But, you know, whoever wrote it was definitely a poet. Let's just say that. So I'd say the best song is the Stone-Faced promotional song. That song was pretty decent all around. And the worst song was Untitled. And now, finally, moving on to Kanye West Stole My Cucumber, the last release in the main thenextgui discography to date. There have been some other remixes and such released, but this, I'm just reviewing the main discography here. The diehard thenextgui fans, I'm sure, have already formed their distinct opinions on all of these other releases and don't need to hear about it from me. Anyways, start off with Gainful Employment. Shockingly, the song actually features some tempo modulation, so that's something new. Generally, it takes about 2 minutes for the song to actually do anything. The first 2 minutes of the song kind of just meander, but after the song starts, after 2 minutes, it's pretty good. Dance is generally pretty bland and uninteresting melodically, and then it layers on some abrasive synth sound on top of it. And on the low end, it sounds like there's some stuttering going on in the low end of this track, which is kind of odd. Next up, we have Rescale, which once again, pretty generic melody. Once again, gonna top it off with some annoying synth sounds, but here they last even longer and indeed are more annoying. Elogiums has a pretty decent melody. It gets reorchestrated a number of times. Then the song, just when I think, okay, this melody is starting to repeat itself, then the song has some motive development into this ambient track. And it's agreeable enough. It's a nice ambient outro. It doesn't offend me. I don't have any issues with this track. Then next up we have California, which is a solid beat, a solid bass line, to develop some solid melodic line on top of that. It's never too repetitive. I'd say that this is a generally coherent song. Well put together. It starts to get just a bit repetitive at the end, but not enough to really piss me off. I thought it was fine. And then we get into Bitoidier, which has a weird syncopated drum beat, which, you know, it's definitely unusual. It's definitely, I appreciate the experimentation, but I think that this drum beat never really grooves. Never really quite grooves with the rest of the song in the way you'd want. So it's kind of distracting, and it just disrupts the beat of everything else that's going on in the song. Generally, my thought on this EP is it's kind of just laid back, it feels like. It's a lot of like slow, laid back beats. It's a little bit too laid back for my personal tastes. I'd say the best song is California. The worst song is Rescaled, and I'm feeling a strong 6 to a light 7 on this one. Thanks for watching my video. Be sure to like, share, and say in the comments below what you thought of these APs. Did you love them? Did you hate them? Let me know. I'm bald.